Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm sure some people are still joining us, so I'm just going to do some introductory remarks here before we get going. Welcome to this third session of the Surf 2020 annual conference, which is focused on principally on land and transport in a climate emergency, but also focusing on post-COVID lessons for building back better in Scotland, across Scotland's communities. So we've had, let me just move this on. For those of you who haven't met me, my name's Andy Milne. I'm the Surf Chief Executive, and I'll be chairing today's session. And before I go further, it's probably worth me saying that this is in this third session, as in the previous two sessions, we are recording this session, and this will go up on a YouTube channel that Surf runs. So if you want to take that into consideration as you make remarks in terms of style or presentation or content, then you should know that you are being recorded, and that will be part of the presentation, which will be available to everybody after the event. So as I say, this is the third session in Surf's annual conference 2020. Surf, for those of you who don't know, is an organisation which brings together all of the partners, processes, policies and practice in regeneration in Scotland. We're supported in that work across our over 300 members, and within those 300 members we have some key sponsoring partners, and you can see their logos here. We're particularly grateful to all of them for their support, and their core support means that we can deliver these events efficiently, collaboratively and free, and we're particularly grateful to the Scottish Government for their support of this and for Surf's broader work. So here's the bit that I almost always miss out. This is the Twitter hashtag for today's event. As you can see, hashtag SurfConf20. So please do use that freely to communicate your enthusiasm or otherwise with the debate this morning, to let the outside world know what's going on at what should be a very interesting event. So, as I say, this is the third and final session. You'll see that we started with Catherine Trebeck mainly as the feature person in our first session on the 27th of August, talking about the climate emergency and how a well-being economy, in her view, was the way forward to sustaining the well-being of people in Scotland in a more fair, equitable economy, and one which was complementary to our wish to remain living on this planet. Second session then last week was a very interesting one with Shona Glenn of the Scottish Land Commission, Heather Cowan, Transport Scotland, about the key issues of land and transport. We'll hear a little bit more later from Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary, about Scottish Government policy, but part of that policy has been increasingly focused on place-based regeneration. Surf's been very involved with that, and so it was really useful to talk about place in terms of land assets, and then about transport as the means of connecting places, both culturally, socially, but also economically, in terms of transfer of resources and production to make that functioning economy in Scotland. So here we are in the third session, focusing on the policy and priorities of the Scottish Government, and we're really grateful to have input today in film and in person from Aileen Campbell, MSP, who's Cabinet Secretary, as you know, for communities and local government. So that will be coming through very soon in the programme. So that's me jumping to what's next, which is not appropriate. So going back, I've already said that Surf is an organisation bringing together all sorts of different people, and this session today has been sold out for some weeks. My colleague Emma Scott has been doing all the organisation, has done a great job in making sure that we've got a very full range of people here. But we've got an opportunity here, by the wonders of new technologies, to find out exactly who we are all together in this third session. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Chris Lawrence, who manages our IT process. And Chris, you're going to help us just with a few let's try and say that again, demographic questions to check out who we've got in the room today. Can you help us do that, please?
Yep, we'll get some polling up and launch.
Okay, so here we go. So first of all, the simple question from Chris is, where are you right now? Are you at home, in an office, place of work, in the garden? You could potentially be in the garden, just about warm enough for that if you've got a coat on. In a public place like a park or a cafe, or somewhere else. We're then asking, second question, if you scroll down, which is the part of the country you're coming from, just so we get an idea of geography in terms of the input. Third question, when you scroll down, is which sector best represents your main professional or voluntary role, so we get an idea of the kind of sector interest. And then the last question, which we're all increasingly interested in, are you expecting another national lockdown this year? So people are voting there. Chris, how are we doing on that? About halfway or something?
Just over halfway, we're doing well.
Great, thank you for your alacrity in voting. I'm going to go, because I think we've got some pretty strong emerging clarity in the first question there, Chris. Over 90% of people very sensibly at home. Boris Johnson, pretty disappointed that less than 10% of you are in an office and 2% are somewhere else. It'd be interesting to know where that is. Okay, I'm going to look at the second question now, Chris, which is geography. So, good spread, good spread. Glasgow, Lanarkshire, west of Scotland, just ahead there at 28%. But a good 23% from Ayrshire, Borders, Dumfries and Galloway, and about just over a quarter from Edinburgh, Lothians and Fife. Some good folks from the Highlands and from North East Scotland up towards Aberdeen and Dundee. And also, as we've had before, a small number of people very welcome from outside of Scotland. Main professional or voluntary role, we've got 43% at the moment saying they're from community, charity or social enterprise, nearly a fifth from public sector in terms of local government and national agencies, and some represented from housing associations, private businesses, which is great. And so the crucial question, are we expecting, gosh, pretty even split here, Chris, I think. 28% saying they are expecting a national lockdown, and almost the same saying no, and just the same again, saying not very sure, don't even want to think about it, says a good fifth of people. Okay, what that allows us to do is give us an idea of who's here, and later on, that when we get to the more substantial questions on policy, that means that we'll be able to then align some of the answers with some of the sectors and give us an idea of what different sectors think of some of the different policy questions that will come up later on. Thank you for your time on that. Okay, we're now really into the business, and I think many of you will know from the series of 15 special bulletins that my colleague Emma Scott ran in identifying positive responses out there, particularly in communities, but also in national agencies, football clubs, all sorts of people, all different kind of positive responses that are being made. Surf has gathered a lot of information on that, and my colleague Elaine Cooper, who specialises in developing shared learning from what Surf learns from across all of the activities, all of the sectors across the whole country, has been doing some research based on those 150 or so positive responses, and we've got a short film here from Elaine Cooper on what we're learning from that process and how we hope to use that. So again, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to run the film from Elaine, and we can get an opportunity to ask her any questions or clarifications thereafter. So over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Hello. As Andy has said, thank you all for taking part today. I'm Elaine Cooper, and I'm responsible for learning and development at Surf. This is a first for me presenting in this way, so please bear with me as I embark on this new adventure. I've been asked to talk about what Surf has learned from COVID. That learning is based on two reports, Lessons from the Front Line, and a second, which is still being tidied up around the edges, Building Community Resilience. I'll start by admitting that much of what Surf has found reflects other findings by other organisations which have been reviewing their own COVID activities or paying consultants to focus on particular areas of interest. Don't get me wrong, our research is interesting and well worth reading, but what makes Surf's reports unusual, if not unique, is that they're only possible because of decades of work that Surf has done building trust within our network. All of this work is based on the experience of those who have been delivering frontline services throughout the pandemic or supporting those who do. Some of you will be here today. More than 150 of you and your organisations have taken part, contributing examples of the many different ways communities and their partners have responded to need. The experience of this unusually large and diverse range of participants represents a broad cross-section of our network, including contributions from every local authority area in Scotland. A special mention here to my colleague Emma Scott, who in her role as Communications Officer initiated Surf's weekly COVID e-bulletins as a way of celebrating, linking and sharing the resilience of our network. Those narratives from the front line provided the valuable data on which we based our first line of research. We've since followed that up with further focused and targeted research, of which I'll speak more later. But these original e-bulletin reports provided us with the first real insights into what has been going on. These practice and place-based experiences shared 10 common themes, and I'll talk you through them in a moment. But what was overwhelmingly apparent right from the start, and as you're all aware, is that while COVID and our national response to it have impacted on our lives in a variety of unpleasant ways, what it has done best, and this seems to be without exception, is to take every single pre-existing inequality and make it worse. But it has also provided us with some inspiring insights into humans at our best. The following themes, therefore, could be seen to demonstrate both our frustration at the damage caused to the most vulnerable and a celebration of those many speedy and flexible and effective responses to those in need. I'll start with volunteers. 2/3 of organisations could not have delivered without them. One survey suggested 3/4 of us volunteered in some capacity between March and June. Some of those would be people continuing in pre-existing more formal volunteer roles, and some would be stepping up to help family and neighbours in their immediate community. But a large body of new people responded to the call for help and made it possible to deliver the essentials and above and beyond that. Surf has found in earlier pre-COVID research that most community organisations depend on the small pool of usual suspects to volunteer, which has led to all kinds of predictable difficulties in the past. This larger pool, which stepped forward, was different, and we need to explore those differences to find ways of sustaining the engagement of at least some of these new volunteer recruits moving forward. Food insecurity. Almost everybody across Scotland was involved in responding to the shameful fact that many, many people living in one of the world's richest nations were but a few days away from hunger. A delayed or reduced pay packet, a disrupted benefit payment, the absence of school dinners, the suspension of food banks and community meals and cafes, and of course restricted movement left people without food. Literally, millions and millions of meals had been distributed to meet demand. And in many ways, those deliveries encapsulated the very best of COVID responses. Private enterprise joined forces with charities, churches, mosques, with council workers, with funders, with the health service, and with those amazing volunteers, and provided and delivered what was needed in inspiring and often ingenious and innovative ways. Which brings me to a third theme, those processes by which organisations adapted existing programmes and created new ones to meet demands. For a while at least, the voices of those who are usually least heard were listened to and responded to. Of course, not all of them, but policymakers and funders and other decision makers joined those frontline organisations in identifying what was needed, where and when, and adapting accordingly. It could also be seen that organisations with already established networks were ahead of the game in setting up signposting and advice hubs. People were confused. Well, we were all confused. And with many of the usual sources of advice and information shut down, suspended, or reduced to a bare minimum, the setting up of signposting systems was key to survival for many. Pre-existing interconnectivity made that much easier. Many of us experienced the way in which lockdown changed what had previously seemed important in our lives. One of the extraordinary findings was the disproportionate impact of relatively small actions. Posting letters, weekly telephone calls, small acts that were thoughtful, kind, and considerate were transformative in their ability to negate some of the impacts of isolation, loneliness, anxiety, and fear. Which brings me to the way in which the experience of those delivery organisations and the partners which supported them highlighted the way in which lockdown created a whole raft of new mental health and well-being challenges and amplified existing ones. We will likely be dealing with the residue of that damage for some while, but it could have been worse. The recognition of this danger informed intelligent, preemptive, mitigating action. Many organisations sought out those at risk and created safety nets to catch the most vulnerable. And I use the word creative advisedly. Creativity has flourished in unexpected places, not just in the creative and innovative processes developed to resolve problems, but in terms of providing and encouraging arts-based activities and engagement. Theatre and other performance venues may still be suffering damaging consequences, but national funders have promoted the use of cultural and creative resources to support widespread participation in processes which have in their turn supported community cohesion, promoted health and well-being, and reduced isolation. In doing so, they've also enhanced connections between communities and cultural, creative, and economic investments. I'm mindful of time here, and I deliberately left 3 themes to last. Those are the raised awareness of Scotland's digital divide, the enthusiastic response to the reduction in red tape around funding and policy, which many organisations experienced, and the benefits which accrued from new collaboration and partnership working, which of course could be said to lie at the heart of almost everything that Surf does. A deep dive into those 3 formed the basis of Surf's second COVID report, Building Community Resilience. The themes were selected as offering the greatest potential for positive, sustainable change and as reflecting the interests of Surf's broad network and its role as Scotland's Regeneration Forum. Those who had already contributed to our first Lessons from the Frontline report have provided more detail of how the 3 prioritised themes impacted on their work, and crucially, we also invited them to suggest changes in process, policy, and targeting of funding and resources to support sustainable improvements. The contributors included representatives of housing associations, local authorities, grassroots frontline community organisations, and funders. The findings from this deep dive can be seen in our Building Community Resilience report, which will be available next week. It is, as was Surf's first COVID report, informed by you, Surf's network. Spoiler alert here. What is clear from both reports is that although there may be a lack of adequately productive connections to and investment from external agencies and resources, the findings again underline Surf's belief that essential knowledge and expertise on regenerating resilient and sustainable communities lies within the communities themselves. Both our reports will be available on our website next week. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to hand you back to Andy now.
People hearing me. So Elaine has moved very efficiently and quickly through what was quite a lot of work in that first report and into the second report, focusing on those 3 issues of digital, relaxation of red tape, more flexibility in the way in which we interact between delivery and resourcing, and the formation of new partnerships. As Elaine says, the report will be out next week. And I'd just like to add one bit on that. This is not just about reports and learning. We are then, as part of our collaborative work with the Scottish Government, setting up a COVID cross-sector connector service run by Surf, which will directly connect this broad-based experience and learning into the resources and priorities of local authority partners, national agencies and others, so that we can learn and turn that learning into good practice and resolve some of the issues that Elaine has highlighted, and also to find ways of sharing good practice. So, I'm now going to just move on rather than offering an opportunity here to get points of clarification from Elaine. We can get that later on in the open discussion session. So Elaine talked about the kind of challenges that are out there that Surf's found, many of which you'll be very familiar with in your own area of work and your own your own geographical area of work as well. The important connection here, of course, is between the local authorities and then national government policy. So I'm really pleased that we've got Aileen Campbell, MSP, in her role as Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, to give us an insight on the kind of investments the Scottish Government is already making in supporting more community-based regeneration in this changing context, and the ways in which it's considering how it needs to further adapt those policies to make the best of the challenges and the opportunities ahead of us. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind, we have a 10-minute film from Aileen Campbell to show, and we'll then get into some question and answer session with the Cabinet Secretary. Over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you this morning. It's great that so many of you have logged on for the final part of Surf's annual conference. And while we are all getting a wee bit more used to online events and gatherings and settling into new patterns and ways of working, times remain tough and challenging. Uncertainty continues for many people on what the future will hold socially and economically. The virus is still out there. We still cannot hug or embrace in the way that we all long for with our friends and family. And the trauma of COVID has not gone away. That's why it's so important we continue to support our people and communities as much as we can. Over the last few months, we have seen an unprecedented response from the people of Scotland. We've seen communities and businesses support each other like never before. And despite the dreadful impact of COVID-19, what gladdened my heart was seeing the countless acts of kindness across Scotland, of people, groups, businesses stepping up to help keep folks safe and well, all motivated by care and compassion. And it's that care and compassion that will be so critical in navigating the future uncertainties the virus has created and helping to rebuild our economy and public services. But we want to go beyond simply recovering and rebuilding. We want to refresh and reform and look to the social and economic renewal necessary to achieve the best future for Scotland. In response to the pandemic, our communities acted quickly and decisively to address urgent priorities. They found innovative and unorthodox ways of working, intensifying partnerships and building new ones to meet these challenges. All of this took trust, it took understanding, and it took cooperation. And as a government, we have also sought to be bold and flexible in our response. We put a comprehensive package of measures in place worth £2.3 billion to help sustain businesses and, crucially, help them pay and treat their staff fairly. Before lockdown, I announced £350 million of support to our communities and households affected most by COVID-19. This investment used a combination of approaches to ensure that resource was mobilised quickly to the places and the people that needed it most. This included delivery of funds such as the Wellbeing Fund and the Supporting Communities Fund, working more closely than ever with partners and community anchors to ensure funding and support was delivered quickly and effectively to our most fragile and deprived communities. The Supporting Communities Fund has proven to be essential to our nation's resilience by ensuring money reaches community groups best placed to meet the needs of people and communities at risk. And so far, we have awarded over £17 million to communities right across the country to deliver a range of urgent and emergency support. Similarly, the Wellbeing Fund has distributed over £21 million of support to equally incredible local endeavour. And in recognition of the impact that COVID is also having on businesses, communities and in our town centres, we provided £3 million to towns, organisations and business improvement districts to address immediate concerns and to allow for continued resilience and support. We also established the national Scotland Loves Local marketing campaign to encourage people to support their local businesses and communities by shopping safely in the high streets near them. The success of Scotland Loves Local has driven us to make another £1 million available to locally based community and third sector groups to develop local marketing and infrastructure projects in their communities. The innovation and the creativity we've seen right across Scotland, supported by some of our funds, has been extraordinary. From virtual high streets to kindness packs, the ways that people have supported and helped have been as diverse and as wonderful as our communities themselves. We cannot mention them all, but I would certainly like to convey a huge thanks to Surf for the work they have done to capture and share these through their COVID updates. Now we have an opportunity to build on this vital network, learn what worked well, what lessons we want to take, and how we can use that to shape the future. For me, the biggest lesson for government is that we could not do this on our own, and that when we work with our communities and when we trust them, the impacts are massive. That needs to guide our approach in the future. And that is why, together with the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, I announced the creation of the Social Renewal Advisory Board. And that board aims to build on the shifts in policy and practice that we have seen as a result of working across portfolios and in partnership with frontline service deliverers in local government, the third sector and in our communities. It aims to bank the policy and practice shifts seen during COVID-19 and utilise our current practice and knowledge with an emphasis on delivering equality and social justice. Its focus is on reducing poverty and disadvantage, embedding a human rights-based approach and advancing equality. Part of this also involves the collaborative review of the Town Centre Action Plan, and that review will shape a vision for the future of our towns and make recommendations to turn that vision into a reality. Now, I know that Surf has played a part in responding to the call for evidence, and I hope that many of you here today have contributed either to the written call for evidence or the public opinion survey, which is open until the end of September. So if you haven't done it already, I would really encourage you to get involved. This approach is already shaping government priorities, and last week we published our programme for government, committing us to establish place-based investment programmes. And this will align all place-based funding initiatives to ensure that we have a coherent approach to progress our 20-minute neighbourhood. That is the creation of thriving, accessible places where people can meet their daily needs online or in person within a 20-minute walk. And as part of this programme, we will invest £275 million over 5 years to support community-led regeneration and town centre revitalisation, and to support the ongoing work on Clyde Gateway in ensuring the transformational regeneration that was promised to local people and communities as a lasting legacy of the Commonwealth Games. And I'm also pleased to announce that we will be providing a further £30 million of capital funding for regeneration to stimulate local construction across Scotland and support disadvantaged areas in the recovery. This is part of the £230 million economic recovery stimulus package announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in June. £12 million is being invested via the RCGF this year to accelerate the delivery of a wide range of locally developed projects right across the country, each helping to meet various regeneration needs and aspirations identified by communities who are best placed to do so. And we're also able to take these steps because we know that community-led and collaborative approaches work best. It was evidenced in the evaluation of the RCGF published late last year, showing how crucial the fund has been in terms of supporting place-based approaches, delivering across many of our policy ambitions and helping to build strong and sustainable communities in all sorts of different geographic settings. £18 million will also be invested this year via the Town Centre Fund, which has been helping to revitalise our town centres and communities across Scotland. This additional capital will enable councils to bring forward delivery of projects that will enhance local living, support footfall and local business, and help to reduce people's carbon footprint as we look ahead to a recovery from the pandemic, but also tackle climate change. So this pandemic has impacted us all, but has not done so equally. It has shown up the persistent and deep inequality that pervades our society and needs to push us to not just accept this as an inevitable consequence of a system that we cannot change. While the challenges before us are significant financially, socially and economically, and while on top of all that we are heading into winter and Brexit uncertainty, we need to use it as an opportunity to change and use what we have better. If we are to rebuild our economy, then it cannot entrench inequality, but must be through the advancement of well-being and community wealth building, putting people first and redirecting wealth back into the local economy and control into the hands of local people. It's not going to be easy and challenging, and changing a system that has been means working together will be ever more important. But the work that Surf and you are all doing in our communities offers us a glimpse of what is possible if we choose to seize it. So thank you sincerely for everything that you have done, but most of all, please stay safe and stay well. And thank you and enjoy the conference.
So thank you very much there, Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell, for that presentation. I'll say for myself that I'm really pleased to be working in a country where we've got a government that first of all recognises where the challenges are and also where the opportunities are at this time of crisis, where we're authentically, I think, trying to connect local community challenges, local community capacity and connections with national government policy and resources. It's a crisis, certainly, but it does look like it's a crisis that we're going to try and face together and take the opportunities from as best we can. So thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to take now a space of about 10, 15 minutes for any particular questions and comments to the Cabinet Secretary. I'd be grateful if you could just briefly introduce yourself in doing so, show who you want to speak. Don't launch into a long diatribe as I want to do from time to time. Try and keep it brief, and that way we can make the best use of the very wide range of experience and perspectives that we've got out here today. So, anybody want to kick us off? And this is the point where I always wish that I'd set up a standard question. Anybody want to raise a first point of question or clarification for the Cabinet Secretary? If not, then I will. Anybody out there, Emma?
Yeah, I've got one raised hand, Andy, from Elaine Cooper from Kilmarnock. So if I could just ask Elaine to unmute and put her camera on, there she is.
Welcome.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. Good morning, Aileen. First of all, sorry to hear you're stepping down. I think you've been excellent in your role, but as Andy said, I'll not spend a lot of time with a preamble. The 20-minute neighbourhood and the programme for government, I'm really interested in this. I'd like to know where it came from, where the idea, the source was, and also the funding. How is that going to be delivered? Will it be through existing mechanisms, or will there be a new approach building on what we've learned from the COVID experience by better involving the local community and the people who have actually stepped up and volunteered and helped out in the time of crisis? Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, hiya. Thanks, Elaine. And for reminding me, this is my last Surf conference as the Cabinet Secretary, so it's fine to be with you all. And
just go for it, Elaine. Just go for it.
Go for it. Oh well, I'll go for it. Yeah, I'm off the can be unleashed. So Elaine, the 20-minute neighbourhood, I think, is one that's been kicking about for a wee while. Sometimes it's been 20 minutes, sometimes I've seen it as 15-minute neighbourhoods. There's been lots of, I think, other countries looking at this as well. I think essentially what it is to try and capture some of the local stuff that we've seen happening. I think there's been a real reconnection with the local high streets. I see it in the town that I stay in myself and in some of the towns that I represent in Clydesdale. And I think what the last 5 months have proven is that you just what you can find on your high street, what you can get locally, and how that is so important. It's been really important to enable people to stay closer to home, to be able to cope with the restrictions that have been put in place. And actually that's been something that I think a lot of people have been wanting to see happen for some time, that reconnection and that vibrancy in our town centres and our high streets. And so this gives us a chance to really pivot towards that, pivot our policies towards that, to make sure that we can support the local agenda as best as we can, and to make sure that in the process that it's not just about regeneration, but actually it's about climate change, it's about people's work-life balance, it's about the wellbeing economy as well. There's far more kind of to be gained, I think, from making sure that people can find what they need as close as they can to where they live. And some of that's not going to be always possible. And actually I think as well that I've seen some people say, well, it's not just about your 20-minute neighbourhood, you've got to make sure that there's stuff there in your town to make people want to be there and want to stick about. And that's that stickability, I think, is a phrase that's quite often used by...
Investment then, and channels of investment was the other part of Elaine's question.
Yeah. So I mentioned the 275 million, and that's going to be distributed in it's trying to align some of the money that we've got already to try and enable what we've seen happening over the last 5 months to happen in a better way. Some of that I think will be done through some of those channels that I've mentioned, RCGF. It's about that longer term signal of investment as well from government, but it's definitely to try and ensure that we do capture what has happened, to not lose that, and to enable that to happen much more visibly. And actually the RCGF, that funding mechanism, that collaboration between communities, local government, national government, has been shown to be so quick and agile that that's why we also, on top of that, have announced the 30 million to try and accelerate some of the plans that are happening across the country, and also to support our town centres. So we'll keep you posted with how you do get in about the money, but I think the big thing is to recognise that this is a longer term signal of government to try and align things in a sensible way, to enable place-based approaches to happen in a tangible sense, and a real shift now about what do we do to make the 20-minute neighbourhoods happen in a practical sense, and basically catch up with all the stuff you have been doing for years.
Thank you, Aileen, and a good point that you make there on making sure that the facilities, resources and connections are actually there so that people really can exist successfully within a kind of 20-mile community, as you say.
Hi Andy, I've got two questions, two people to bring in. I've got Paul McAlinden first from Govan, and then Sophie Bridger to bring in after that. So
Thank you.
Paul, I'll just ask you to start your video and unmute.
Oh, well, then I'll just read out the question that everybody can see. So there has been a disruption in who holds power locally, particularly since lockdown, and those who've been on the ground have been very effective and agile in meeting local needs, whereas traditional agencies who were physically more distant from local areas have been less effective at the beginning. But they're now coming back to work, and the system is beginning to reboot. So how do we preserve the new groundswell of agencies and individuals and informal groups who've reacted so well to responding to the community in lockdown?
Thank you, Paul. And you're working mostly from Govan these days, Paul, yeah?
Totally, yeah, completely focused on Govan.
Thank you.
Okay. And I think that's a really good point. Again, that's why we've sought to bring together a group of people, experts, people, good big thinkers, to try and enable us to capture what's happened and not lose it, because you know, I think as well as the time goes on, you're right, Paul, I think you start to see things going back into the old ways of working, and we can't let that happen, because I think what's happened over the last 5 months, aside from the trauma of COVID, aside from all the horrible harshness of it all, the stuff that has worked well has been that local agility, and how do we make sure that we can empower people to see that happen. So I think there's a number of things that had been happening before COVID that should provide us with a bit of a platform to build on. There was a local governance review. There was that we were trying to kind of do what you've said in your question, trying to kind of shift the power balance a bit. That's always tricky, because that is about testing and challenging vested interests as well, whether that's government, local government, NHS. That's a whole host of things that we need to try and shift there. So sometimes I feel a bit frustrated about the pace in which we can move these things forward. But the last 5 months have shown that when you roll up your sleeve, work together, things can happen pretty quickly. So the Social Renewal Advisory Board is about just what you say. How do we make sure we capture what's happened, and what are the lessons and the recommendations and actions that government need to take, and all of us need to take across public life, and also the hard questions as well for the wider third sector as well too. So it's about challenging the whole system, and that's what I mean when I say, you know, we can't just go back to the old system. That old system entrenched those inequalities. Now we've got a chance to think about how do we reboot that, and that doesn't have to happen overnight either, because I think some of these changes, if they're felt to be immediate, that can feel uncomfortable. We can do this over a long period of time as well, so that people can feel a bit more comforted by the changes that I think we all want. But I see it in my communities as well. People have reacted incredibly, and that's not because of any structure the government's put in place or the local government's put in place. That's because people have acted with care and they've had the shackles taken off them. They've been supported to do what they wanted to do and needed to do, and they've been trusted. So I think in relation to what Elaine mentioned as well, it's that relaxing the red tape is going to be vitally important, I think, as well, and to be a bit less risk averse and a bit more comfortable with, you know, taking a punt on things, which is maybe not your usual government line, but I think we need to get into that space.
Great. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I think, you know, you've touched on that. COVID has shown the levels of inequality have literally been a matter of life and death over time and in this crisis in a completely unacceptable way, and that's been widely recognised. So there is a change underway. As you've said, it may take some time. And it may be a bit of a challenge as well, because inside this, it's not just about red tape, is it? It's about the balance of power, and the shifting of the balance of power is always a big challenge. So, second question. Thank you for that, Paul. Second question.
That is from Sophie Bridger, who works with the Eden communities.
Sophie, over to you.
Just join us.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi. Yes, Sophie Bridger from Eden Project Communities. Thank you. I'm really encouraged by all the initiatives that the Scottish Government are taking forward as a result of this and everything that you've been saying so far. I think a lot of us have been very concerned by the isolation that obviously has endured even after lockdown has lifted. And this is something a lot of us are very concerned about as we go into winter.
Yep.
And just to ask basically how the Scottish Government and the Social Renewal Advisory Board be looking at supporting opportunities for community connection and reducing isolation, as well as things like community wealth building.
So more on the isolation front, Aileen.
Okay. So I think, and it's good to kind of hear from the Eden communities as well. So thank you, Sophie. We're already at a national level really trying to think hard about the resilience going forward. We would do that anyway at this point in time, with winter on the horizon, but there is a load of other concurrent risks that are happening. So regardless of what you think of Brexit, Brexit's going to be a difficulty and it's going to pose challenges. So we need to, that's going to be layered on top of any potential second spike, the fact that the months of winter are colder, more expensive, harder for people to cope in. So there's a huge amount of challenge there. So we're already thinking about how do we cope with that, and how do we do that when, you know, resources are pretty much depleted as well. So how do we act and reprioritise and shift focus in the most appropriate way? In terms of the community connection, I think some of the work that Andy mentioned as well about the connector work is going to be important. The Social Renewal Advisory Board is also not just about gathering together a load of experts and academics and big thinkers. There's also been a real push and drive to make sure that we capture lived experience or direct experience as well. So we're using the good connections that we've got already, whether that's the Poverty Truth Commission, whether that's the work that Elaine, Fiona Lee, is taking forward from East Ayrshire around making sure that every local authority gets a chance to feed in their thoughts and views into and their experiences and to help drive and shape the future policy. And on a really practical level, and again that goes back to Elaine's presentation around the sudden propelling of digital isolation being a real thing. Yeah. That is something now that we've got a real policy drive behind. So in a really practical sense, the Connecting Scotland project is about trying to plug some of that gap. It won't do it all, but it's a start, and it signals a real drive for us to not just give folk devices, but to also wrap around some of the support that is required. And it's a really excellent example of the local government, national government and the third sector working together to try and make this work. And as I understand it, it's unique in the world, this approach. So a lot of countries are given devices, but a lot of other countries are not doing that wider wrap around it as well. And I know from having elderly parents that don't live on my doorstep just how important being able to kind of connect via Facebook or whatever has become, and we need then to make sure that people can do that, and also recognise that a huge amount of opportunity that presents. I met somebody who, because of the Connecting Scotland project, has now enrolled in college to do to do a care course so that she can get a better job, and that's immediate. That's an immediate reaction to what Connecting Scotland can achieve, as well as keeping our daughters in education. So I think there's a number of ways in which the board or work with other groups like Surf can do some of the things that you're asking, Sophie, but in a really tangible sense, Connecting Scotland shows that we're putting our money where our mouth is to try and plug that digital gap.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it goes back to one of the points that Elaine touched on, of these small acts of kindness alongside the enhanced level of volunteering. And there's some and that kind of connects across to this digital divide, which Elaine also found from her research. So it's about some kind of balance between using IT technology to support the more participative, hands-on. And I really liked the way, I was really proud about the way the Scottish Government responded to the test and follow-up process, in contrast to the much more technical approach from the Westminster Government, which was trying to get Serco to recruit 10,000 people in a call centre somewhere. The Scottish Government was thinking much more about local health officers, local authorities, community and voluntary organisations to have that human input. So the balance between both of those seems to me to be going some way to thinking intelligently about the issues of isolation, loneliness and dislocation that Sophie brought for us there.
And aside from the Connecting Scotland stuff, I met with Remade in Glasgow just last week, and they've got a contract now with, I think, with Glasgow City Council to get their old computers. They're refurbishing them, right. So they're providing jobs, they're avoiding landfill, and they're getting people connected. And it's the similar work I saw from Ailsa and Inveralba and Argyll and Bute, again refurbishing old devices and giving them to folk that don't have them. So absolutely, there's a zero waste kind of element to it. There's whole
and there's community enterprise jobs in there. There's green jobs in there. It's about making the best of this. Okay, so I'm going to move on, if that's all right. I'm really hoping you'll be able to stay with us, Aileen, because we're going to now move into a session now, which we're going to try and make some use of all of the intelligence, views and experiences out there. This is Surf. Every time that a Scottish parliamentary election comes round, Surf uses its own resources and its own networks and connections to pull together a manifesto. And I'm going to introduce my colleague Derek Rankin, who manages the Surf policy processes, to tell us just a little bit about that, Derek, and then take us into some questions that you're going to introduce to gather some views from the substantial constituency we've got here today. Over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Derek Rankin. I'm the policy manager here at Surf, and I'm just going to very briefly give you an overview of the development process behind our 2021 manifesto for community regeneration. This is actually our fourth policy manifesto. We've produced others in advance of the Scottish Parliament elections in 2007, 2011 and 2016, and each manifesto was based on extensive consultation with cross-sector regeneration practitioners, and it allows us to produce a set of bold and practical policy recommendations across physical, social and economic regeneration. Each manifesto sets a foundation for Surf's policy influencing activities across a whole term of the Scottish Parliament, and it informs our continuous programme of work. The objective is to constructively influence the policies, processes and investments of the Scottish Government, as well as local governments and other national agencies. Surf Manifesto set out the reality of the contemporary regeneration context and lets us argue for what this, lets us tell the next Scottish Government what Surf members want it to do differently in response to priority problems and opportunities. So the 2021 manifesto process has been split into 13 themes covering various aspects of community regeneration. We originally intended to have a series of 13 workshops starting in April. Obviously we had to cancel those as a result of the pandemic, and we've proceeded remotely by arranging video and telephone interviews on semi-structured interviews with a wide range of Surf contacts who have particular perspectives and experience on each of our 13 themes. So far, we've completed interviews on poverty and inequality, inclusive growth, the climate crisis, culture, heritage and transport, and we're currently on housing with several other topics to come in September, October and November. The manifesto process is ongoing, but some emerging messages so far include a strong desire for additional post-pandemic support for young people, increased investment in community development infrastructure, quicker action on climate change, and there's very strong interest in the community wealth building pilot activity that the Cabinet Secretary referred to earlier on.
Derek seems to have frozen there. Okay, assuming that Derek's going to remain frozen for a little bit, we'll get him back as soon as we can. Chris, maybe we could just move to the questions that Derek had set up for.
Yep.
Thank you.
You can see the questions there, and we're going to put them up as polling as well. So polling is, we just need to get the right set.
Derek, so you want to pick up again? We just lost you briefly there.
Sure, thank you, Chris. Sorry, people missed what I said at the end. I'll post a link in the chat box with more information, and we'll take you through some general multiple choice questions, which will help inform our manifesto context section. So you should see 5 questions in front of you. Is that there now, Chris?
Yes, I'm launching the polling now.
Great. So it'll work the same as before. Just please click on your preferred answer. The first question, we want to know what's your general view of the prospects for building back better, with thinking of poorer communities in particular. The first option you'll see is if you're feeling mainly optimistic, if you think that some of the more cooperative investments that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, other things that are happening that are focusing on well-being, wealth and sustainability for poorer places, maybe more so than it's been in the past. Do you think that's all going to make a positive difference? That's the first option. Or maybe you're feeling a bit more pessimistic. Maybe you're feeling, despite the best intentions of all stakeholders, poorer places will get poorer in the face of some of the challenges to come. Or if you've got no view or mixed feelings about prospects for building back better, there's no option there for that one. So there's 5 questions in total, and you can scroll down to answer them all. Question 2, there's one choice in this one. If you had to pick only one, which of the following interventions do you think would best support a post-pandemic economic recovery in Scotland? 6 choices there. First one is a job guarantee scheme for young people. Secondly is climate change investments that create jobs. Third one is digital infrastructure and training investment. Fourth one is direct support programs for businesses and social enterprises. Fifth choice is extra income support for the poorest households. And the 6th one is more area-based initiatives in the most deprived places. That's which of the following interventions you think would best support a post-pandemic economic recovery in Scotland?
So just picking one of those, Derek, just
one of those for question 2, but for question 3, you can choose up to 3 answers, and these are the topics and investment areas that you might like to see prioritised in local regeneration activity next year and beyond. So you can see a number of choices there. You can select up to 3. So there's community-led regeneration, culture and heritage, economic development, employability and skills, health and well-being, housing, support for minority groups, town centre regeneration, transport, and vacant and derelict land and buildings. I see quite a few answers coming in. 4th question is about your view of the place principle, which the Scottish Government and COSLA support. We'd like to know what your general view is of the place principle. Do you think it's encouraging greater collaboration and participation in place-based regeneration? Or do you think it's well meant but lacking in practical application? Or do you think it's not the best approach to regeneration? Or perhaps you think it's too early to judge? Or if you don't know what the place principle is, that's the final option there. And very finally, question 5 is about the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery. Their report to the Scottish Government identified 4 pillars of the Scottish economy. Bit of a challenging one this, but if you'd only pick one of the 4 pillars, which one do you think should be prioritised for actions and investments in supporting building back better in poorer places? The choices are business, which is about economic capital and financial assets, or community, which is defined as civil society organisations and local community groups and social networks. Third option is environment, natural capital, And then the final option is people, knowledge, skills and health. So as Emma's saying in the chat box, question 3, several answers, all the others are single choice. So I see we've got 65% of votes coming in. We'll maybe just take a few more and I'll hand over to you to break down the results, Chris.
Okay, thank you.
Good, 70% done now, that's good. Some difficult questions in there, I think, some difficult choices, as government has to face from time to time.
Yes, I know some people would have liked to see an all of the above option in a few questions, which is very fair, but I think most people would tick all of the above if that option was available.
Also, Derek, just to remind people that because of the demographic questions we did at the start, in the subsequent analysis, we'll be able to see which particular sectors took which particular view on particular issues, if you follow me. Good, so you've got more than 3/4 of the voting in now. Just another brief period, then we should probably call it. That's over 80% now, that's not bad. And we're on time. Okay, I think if we can get past 85, I think you should just go for it, Chris.
Yes, okay. Maybe another 10 seconds.
Yeah, that's 85.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. I'll share the results.
Sound, but I don't know how to do it.
That's the results shared then. So, first question, you can see the general prospects for building back better. Mainly optimistic, at 60%. Very strong view there. If you only had to pick one of the following interventions, well, it's more area-based initiative is definitely out front, but all the rest are equal, more or less. So
more area-based initiatives in the most deprived places. I think that's an important point there, isn't it? That occasionally falls out of focus, that the focus is on deprivation rather than just places per se.
Okay. Which of the following would you see prioritised? Choice of 3, community-led regeneration right there at the top, and it looks like health and well-being, and right at the bottom, vacant and derelict land and buildings, but town centre regeneration is right there as well.
Yeah, very similar, very similar.
And employability skills. The third choice is very similar. There's some strong third choices.
Health and well-being very strong as well. Yep.
Yes. And place principle, well meant but lacks practical application and outcomes. Nearly half of you have said that. And in third, encouraging greater collaboration, over a third there.
Yeah, quite a good response and positive support though overall.
And as you were saying, Andy, we can look at the breakdown by sector, and that might reveal more about some of these answers and how different groups are feeling about them.
Interesting in there to see though, Chris, that nobody is saying that it's not the way to go.
Yes.
The questions are about whether we've got it sufficiently practical. And Cabinet Secretary will be pleased to hear that almost everybody is at least familiar with the place principle.
Yes. And at the end here, we've got the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, 4 pillars, community out there, and people and knowledge, skills and health. People very strongly at the end there.
Good. Thank you very much for that. Is that this is part of an ongoing process in gathering views towards the manifesto. Derek, I'm going to put you on the spot here. We're hoping to have a first draft of that manifesto by when? What's the plan there?
Yes, we're looking to complete the interviews by mid-November, so hopefully we'll have a first draft by mid-December, and the parties are already developing their manifestos, so we're feeding views in as we're going along, but we'll look at launching that very early in January. And right. Our usual process to arrange a hustings event and ask the various party representatives how they would respond to the manifesto and implement any of the policies that resonate with their own views.
Good. And in the past, of course, we've always managed to do that as an open, real, live hustings event. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that by the time we get round to that, we'll be able to continue in that style. Okay, thank you for that, and thanks for your participation. It's always really interesting to check those views. I hope that was of some interest to the Cabinet Secretary and to other colleagues here. So we've now got about 20 minutes for open discussion. You've heard from Elaine's research, you've heard from the Cabinet Secretary, you've seen some of the opinions of your colleagues here on where the priorities are, where the preferences are. So, any further comments or questions that anyone would like to make, indeed to Derek or to Elaine or to Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell? Got anybody lined up, Emma?
Well, I did with Stephen, but Aileen's helpfully answered that in the chat group and is going to help him out with that. But I've got Mohammed Razak has made a point on the chat group that he might want to expand on. If I can just bring him in.
Hi.
Hello there. Hi, Mohammed.
Hi. Just what it says there, really, I think what I fear coming from the voluntary sector and knowing a lot of affiliated organizations, that yes, it's been great that there has been resilience fund at the moment in terms of, you know, moving from, you know, face-to-face to distance service delivery, and it's been really wonderful. All the different organizations, governments and everything have kind of pulled in to support organizations to deliver as best as they can for the moment. But I think what has happened is it's now 6 months. All the apart from, you know, local government and national government, all the other funders have stopped their long-term funding. Just the moment, there's no applications that you send. And that will have a very detrimental effect on a lot of organizations going, because normally they would apply this time of the year for the following year for 2 or 3 years long-term provision that they wanted to support their stakeholders, but they're not able to do that. So once we get out of this, they will not have any resource to go forward. So there will be a gap, because sometimes when you apply for resources, there's a kind of a window of 3 months or 6 months before you will get a yes or a no, and you know, and start doing that work. So I think that that's something we need to be aware of, and governments should be aware that they need to look at that, how that you know, the charities and foundations are managing that. And certainly with COVID and all the businesses being down a bit, there will be less money also coming forward as well. So it's just that point to see how the government will cope with that, because you could have all of a sudden, as somebody mentioned, you know, there's a lot of small organizations, local organizations, you know, stepped up to support local communities, but we could have the reverse effect very soon.
Okay, that's essentially the issue of sustainability, everybody having thrown their lot in and expended their resources, and many of those national organisations rethinking what their funding strategy is going to be going forward. And you're raising a risk there, a risk for the sustainability of those valuable organisations and their services. You've already touched on this, Aileen, though, in your introduction about that kind of support.
I may have missed that, Chair, because I joined a bit late.
No, sorry, no, it's fine. I also think there's not an easy answer to this either, because I think it's going to be complicated and challenging, and it's not going to be one single thing that kind of helps. So from a practical point of view, I know from my portfolio we've tried to provide a bit more longer term funding. Any awards that we give, we try and do it over a longer term. That gives a bit more certainty. So I guess it's that kind of principle that's often kind of talked about in the third sector, about getting out of that 1 year cycle, which would help to a point. I think there's opportunity as well with the community wealth building approach around procurement, about making that feel fairer, and that maybe making sure that there is a sense of parity for third sector and voluntary organisations in amongst that. And I think again there's opportunity in there. In our programme for government, we set out that we wanted to try and elevate some of the discussions around parity, and not just having organisations like yours or third sector more generally kind of being left with what's ever left from the budget once a local government or a national government or a health board has made their decisions. How do we kind of elevate the discussion to make sure that the third sector is recognised as something that should be seen on a par with the rest of statutory services. And I think the campaign at SCVO, is it never more needed, is trying to kind of make that point. And also from the Communities Fund as well, we're going to be looking to see how develop some of the funding that's there into a longer term, more recovery kind of approach as well. But this is not all going to be it's not going to be the answer. And I think with businesses and with some of the things that we've got, the hard side of it is that it's going to be tough, and I don't know if we can save everything. No. But I think what we need to do is maximise every kind of power and tool and lever and bit of resource that we have to try and do our best. And I think that's why the collaboration and the dialogue is going to be so critical. But we're going to be announcing some of the details around the recovery funds next week, but it's going to be challenging and tough. Another bit that we're doing as well is we're trying, my officials are working with some of the other funders to try and make sure that we align it more completely as well. And you know, that's an imperfect science, but at least if we try and align ourselves as best we can with funders, then it maybe makes a bit more strategic use of the resources that are out there. And we've been working with Oscar. Oscar have been doing a lot of deep dives to try and get a sense and temperature check of the sector too. So once that data's out as well, that will be really helpful to help inform our way forward.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And there's a massive challenge here for local authorities as well, though, isn't there? I mean, I've had many discussions with local authority colleagues recently who have illuminated for me the kind of challenges that they're facing in raised level of demand across the piece, across their statutory services, and the pressure that puts on them for delivering the kind of resources that we would like to see, connecting them across to community and voluntary organisations, which is, of course, not a statutory function. So there's an attempt to shift this whole model here in the middle of a crisis. So I don't know if there are any local authority here colleagues that would like to comment on those kind of challenges and how they're looking at that and how they would look to move to that more localised interactive partnership model through and on the other side of this crisis. So Emma, anybody else that we've got to come in or anything on related point?
Just the community wealth building, the PF highlighted the work, the more intensive work with some local authorities. I think Clipman and Shire, there's already the existing one in Ayrshire, and Tayside Deals, I think the Glasgow City region as well. So there's maybe an opportunity amongst that to kind of demonstrate how you can shift some of that focus. Absolutely,
and that's exactly, as I said earlier, back to Surf Zone work, the cross-sector COVID connector service that we are running, and we've already got dates set up for doing that in 5 different geographical locations across the country to capture the particular circumstances and interests of those areas. Will be an important part of sharing that information and trying to get people to shift into a very collaborative practice. So Emma, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I've got one more question from John Halliday, who's with Community Renewal. John, if you want to switch on your camera and sound, please.
Got John there. Welcome, John.
Hi. I think everyone on this call probably has a great deal of confidence in how the Regeneration budget and the Communities budget, the third sector division, is kind of aligning around wellbeing economy and this recovery. I'm interested in what we can do to influence the money that would naturally flow through, business investment routes, and how we direct that towards specifically community enterprise, and make sure that, for instance, if there was another pivotal enterprise resilience fund, it was clear that community enterprise is like top and center of our priorities at the moment. So what can we do to influence those other departments and other ministers, frankly?
Very, very welcome question there. And this is something that Surf has been working on with government colleagues about making that bridge from local regeneration capacity into macroeconomic policy, where the bigger resources are. Aileen, I know this is something that you've worked on long and hard in government as well. So since this is your last Surf conference, you could really go for it and tell us it like it is.
Yep, any help you can give, John, please, would be great. And I think, so there had been varying different kind of comments around Benny Higgins' report, but I think actually on the whole it kind of touched the areas that people wanted to see highlighted, and I think there was a recognition of third sector community-led organisations as well in amongst that. So And I'm always conscious that our previous poverty advisor, Naomi Eisenstadt, always used to say to me when I came to post that it's fine for you to sit in front of your own officials and align your aspirations and your views and your vision. They'll deliver on that. The trick will be to sit in front of other departments and try and get them to do the same thing. And I think, you know, that's a reality that government has to face, about trying to wrench yourself out of the silos and make sure that we're maximising the totality of our resource. And that goes back, Christie Commission, whole host of different ways of trying to get that to happen. And I think there is a recognition. I think there is now that there is, coming out of this massive economic challenge, that we can't just go back to building roads or putting in new motorways and all the rest of it, and that's going to be the thing that we point to as part of our recovery. That actually the wellbeing economy, the community wealth building approach, regeneration, community-led endeavour, recognising what communities did over the last 5 months, that's having an impact now. But we'll always have to keep on chipping away to make sure that it doesn't get missed in amongst the big regional deals, amongst the big city deals, to make sure that we and I keep on making that point as best as I can to my colleagues. But don't forget, my colleagues are all constituency MSPs as well, who recognise what's going on their doorstep. So I think it's about more than just the cabinet ministers. It's also about making sure that the government as an institution recognises the importance of this, and anything that you can do to help with that is going to be really, really important. But I think we're slowly starting to see, with the place of our approach, the investment that has been signalled for community-led regeneration, that we're starting to see that movement happen. And I think the heightened awareness and of the wellbeing agenda is going to be critical too. And also, if government wants to make good on those national performance framework ambitions, then the reality is you're not going to get that delivered through road building or big things like that. You're going to get it through the work that you're doing, and that's the kind of the harsh reality that government will have to face up to, and that we are doing, and we have signalled that in a programme for government. But it'll take a bit of time, but we need to continually, I think, make the case, and your help will be essential to that.
Very good, thank you. Really good question. Thanks, John.
Andy, I've got another. Yep, I've got Barbara Kerr from Surf Strands. Just get her to join.
Good, Barbara.
Hello.
Hi,
Again, it's kind of about the volunteer activity that is taking place over the last few months. So I was just wondering, there was talk of the kind of core volunteers that have been doing it, but then this increase in volunteer activity, the sort of larger pool, and supporting that continued activity. So I was just wondering, is there a sense at all of whether that increased volunteer capacity was due to people being on furlough and so having a lot more time and capacity to offer themselves as volunteers? And if so, then as people return to full-time work, how can that continued activity be supported? Because obviously their capacity to take part in those community activities will be greatly reduced. So yeah, how can government at various levels and the third sector continue to support that activity to happen?
Thank you, Barbara. Before I put Aileen on this, I'm going to go back to my colleague Elaine Cooper just on that, in terms of what Barbara's referring to there, that surge in volunteering, that new army of volunteers, shouldn't use that word, that new core of volunteers that have been developed out there. Is that sustainable in itself? Did we talk about that in our research, and how that might be supported to be something that can be continued?
I think well, there's two things. Surf has been involved in research into this before. So pre-COVID, there were definitely issues around those usual suspects of volunteers suffering from fatigue, the actual volunteer activities and meetings being formed in such a way that it was difficult for people with kids or people with jobs to actually take part. So in previous research we've done, we certainly looked at ways of making volunteer activity more accessible, and I don't think any of those factors have changed. The furlough people, what was interesting, some of the reports I saw and some of the research I was looking at was that the people who were volunteering where sometimes people hadn't been able to do so because they were required to be physically in places at times that were impossible for them. And actually, COVID, furloughs, places being closed down, things having to be done digitally, actually increased their ability to participate. So certainly some of the old findings would apply just as well now as they had previously.
Good, thank you. And just before I go again back to you, Aileen, Emma, you were saying colleagues.
So
Yeah.
Kathleen Caskey represents GCBS, the umbrella body for the third sector in Glasgow, and they ran a really successful kind of volunteer kind of bank. So I'm just going to bring Kathleen in because she's been typing in the chat. Well, she's saying Glasgow TSI, not GCBS she's from, but I'm just going to bring her in because she's put some interesting kind of insights in the chat group.
My mistake, apologies. On to you, Kathleen.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, I wasn't actually planning to say anything. I was just typing in the chat because I have that data to hand because we've done a look at what's been happening in Glasgow. Very sceptical about the national volunteer recruitment, Aileen, I'm sorry to say, because simply people were saying we don't want unvetted volunteers. We're trying to deliver packages to blah, blah, you know, to vulnerable people. We've got data protection. There was a whole raft of issues around that. So the stat I put in there was a survey that the TSIs did of their members across Scotland, which, as I say, found that only 13% took on new volunteers during COVID. And part of the issue was that existing volunteers had their PVG, they had their data protection training. And I think people were really scared, people who were newly furloughed and turning up and saying, I want to volunteer. Nobody knew who they were. So we need to think about that a wee bit more, because I think there was a general impression that of a mass outpouring of volunteering, but certainly in Glasgow, that wasn't really happening on the ground. People were working with their existing volunteers and staff and partners across the collaboration. So it's more just an observation. I didn't really plan to say anything. Can I go now?
Yes, thank you. Sorry for ambushing you there, Kathleen. Over to you, Aileen.
No, thank you. And Kathleen, I'm glad you did, because I think, you know, I think from the outset of the pandemic, I think the First Minister, and we've all made clear that, you know, it was unprecedented, and these things, and not everything was going to be right, and not everything was going to be smooth, and sometimes things might feel clunky, and sometimes things might not work the way you hope. And what we recognised, though, was that there was a desire across the country for folk to find some way to try and offer up their spare time, or to try and be involved. And so we tried to kind of put the structure to try and avoid some of the things that you mentioned, Kathleen, and British Red Cross were involved, Volunteer Scotland were involved as well, to try and support that work, to make sure that volunteers had a way to kind of offer up what they wanted to do, and to have some kind of system approach to try and guard against some of those kind of fears and anxieties that you describe. And we tried to make sure as well that when people signed up to that they were very much aware that they might not get immediately used either, because it wasn't always going to be possible to deploy them, and actually there's going to be ongoing requirements for them to contribute help and support later on. So there has been a lot of work to try and make sure people are very clear about that message. And there has been examples though where people have drawn down on those volunteers and used them as well, and that's been helpful in terms of replacing some of the folk that might have ordinarily been volunteering, who might have been more vulnerable to COVID, who had to then take a step back from that. But there's and to link that into Barbara's question as well, I know that Volunteering Scotland have been doing a bit more kind of analysis of what prompted or what made people more likely to volunteer. Who were they as well? Was it because they had more free time? Was it because they weren't having to commute as much? You know, all these different things that enable people to step up. So I think for me now is about trying to take the positives of it. There is a clear sense that people wanted to contribute, and there's a clear number of people who wanted to do it that hadn't been doing it before. So how do we capture that? Just like all the policy improvements that we were talking about earlier, how do we capture that? There is a circle within the advisory board that's looking specifically at volunteering, so that we can try and then take the observations that Kathleen has made and others, to try and then think about what do we then do going forwards, and how do we make volunteering a bit more of a thing that people can do that's routine or fits in with their life, that's bespoke and tailored to the free time that they have, and to not just lose that clear desire that people have shown across the country to be involved. We've got the volunteering framework, there's now data, we're looking at it, we've got the circle and advisory board, and absolutely, if anybody on the conference today has further observations like Kathleen has, I think that's incredibly useful, because I don't think we want to pretend or soft soap you that everything worked well exclusively because it was government led or whatever. That if there are things that we need to do to change it and make it better, then we're willing to do that and to learn from it.
Great. I think that's a really good point at which for me to just try and pull this together into the summary and telling you what's happening next then. My mind goes back, as it does, to historical events, and the 2016 Surf Manifesto, the last manifesto that we did, which Derek, my colleague, referred to, was primarily concerned with levels of poverty and inequality, and it focused on the connections between place disadvantaged, and economic policy. That's what we really majored on in that manifesto. Since then, the climate emergency has accelerated, and the poverty and inequality has persisted. And we got to the point in the COVID crisis, by the time we had set up this conference, based on the connections between land, real places, real local assets, and transport, the way in which we can connect those places into a national framework of exchange and cooperation. That was the focus. But we've now found ourselves not just in a climate emergency, but as the Cabinet Secretary has referred to very correctly, in a very immediate crisis of COVID. And that crisis, there's a kind of crude comment about never allowing a crisis to go to waste. And so within this crisis, there are real opportunities, and we've explored some of them today. The raised level of awareness and appreciation of what it is that happens at the local level, the importance of putting together assets, challenges, people, knowledge, participation at that local level. But the point that John made there at the end, I think, is a crucial one, about how that then gets connected into the wider framework of national policy and resources, in which, as Elaine referred to, is still one of the richest countries on the planet. We are not short of resources overall. The question is about the kind of policy decisions we make about how we connect and direct those resources. So the crisis here that we've been discussing has illuminated some essential necessities of making some changes, and the Cabinet Secretary, it's been really encouraging to have your input on the kind of thinking that's going on in government, which is evident from the outside, and it's good to get that reassurance that that thinking is still fluid and ongoing and is still in learning mode. And I really hope that Surf and organisations like Surf and the Surf membership will take up your offer to continue to contribute to that discussion and to inform that policy debate, and then to support the kind of action that comes out of that at the other end. Surf will certainly be continuing that, not just in our own manifesto process, but in collaboration with all of our member groups through the COVID Sector Connector Service, which the Scottish Government is supporting us in delivering over the coming period. So we've had then 3 sessions. First one on the climate emergency, essentially, and how to build a more successful wellbeing economy. We've looked in particular at land and transport and engagement in the private sector in the second one. And in this last session, we've had a really good input and discussion with Aileen Campbell in her last Surf conference. And I should just note here that Aileen has been a tremendous supporter of Surf and its work over the years, our awards processes, as well as our conferences and other events. So I'm always sincere, but I am really sincere in saying you'll be greatly missed, not just by Surf, but across the regeneration sector. Aileen, you've done a great job. I'm now going to just move briefly to my colleague Emma Scott. You're going to give us a little bit on what's next, Emma, and then the Surf chair, Kate Wimpress, is going to give thanks to everybody and close up. Over to you, Emma.
Yep, so I'm going to run this week without slides because my connection living rurally can be a bit temperamental. So just firstly on Surf membership, some of you here are members, some aren't. So if you are interested in Surf membership, it's £20 for community groups and individuals and £50 for all other organisations. It gives you early access to these sorts of events, particularly if they're going to sell out. You get priority booking on those. You're able to input into consultations, whether they're Scottish Government consultations or Derek's manifesto process. And it also provides networking opportunities and a chance for you to share events and things that we are happy to then share to our wider network via our social media and website. For the past 2 events, I have heavily touted the Surf Awards at this point. But they actually closed on Monday. But I will just note that we had a healthy response despite the challenges that organisations are facing this year. So we are really grateful to everyone who's put in an application. The applications have been inspiring, they have been thought-provoking, they have been forward-thinking, and they have been creative in the way that many organisations from across the whole of Scotland have responded to a challenge that no one has ever faced before and that we didn't really know what to do with at the start. So for them to so quickly adapt has been something quite special. So I envy the judges because I have nothing to do with picking the winners or the shortlist, but I do envy them that challenge. So just lastly on the awards, the shortlist will be announced on the 25th of this month, so if you keep an eye out on our social media, sign up to the Surf bulletin, then you'll find out who that anticipated shortlist is on the 25th. So just lastly, someone asked in the chat group, so just in case you haven't been checking that, about the sector connector process and looking for when those events will be available. If you sign up to the Surf mailing list or you just keep an eye on the Surf website, there'll be further information on there very soon. So I can also pick up with everybody that's attended the events and let them know when they're on there. So just lastly, I sent you all an evaluation form for the event. I'd be really grateful because we've not got physical events to gather them back in. If you could send them back to me via email at emma@surf.scot, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Yeah, so as chair of Surf, it's my job to bring the series of conferences to a close, and I just want to thank everybody who have contributed so generously to the 2020 conference series. So this enforced paradigm shift has really opened up opportunities as well as given us challenges, and I think 2 of the key things that have come across in the last 3 series is, one, the accessibility of this way of interacting, and the recording and sharing of the conference presentations. They're online now, and I think there's a real value in this ability to revisit many of the challenging and inspiring contributions we've had, and also the interactive nature of the engagement. I for one, am a big fan of the interactive polls, so thanks to Chris for that. So thanks to all our speakers across the last 3 sessions, Catherine Trebek, Shona Glenn, Heather Cowan, Nick Skelton, and of course today to our Cabinet Secretary, Elaine Campbell, for being so generous in her time and also her contributions, and finally to thank the Surf team for putting this together in such an incredibly enjoyable and I think slick fashion. Perhaps as a social enterprise we should be selling our services as online conference organisers, because it has really been a phenomenal piece of work, so thanks to everybody who has put this all together so well. I think just to finish, I wanted to say the common themes have come across in the 3 discussions: support for those community anchor organisations who have been so adept and dynamic across the last 5 months, and that the ability, trust has been a key word that has come up again and again and again, and the partnerships that have been developed between those on the ground and the local and national government agencies, and that desire and need, overriding need for local connectedness and place-based development, and this 20-minute community that is really coming to the fore just now. I'm very pleased that Aileen is sharing thoughts about trust and partnerships and being slightly unorthodox. I think those all play well to Surf's strengths and the abilities of our 300+ membership on the ground. And I think it's our job now to challenge and harness this thinking and really work to shift the balance of power to contribute to the overarching aim of SURF, which is to improve the lives and opportunities of residents in Scotland's most disadvantaged communities. So I think we've just gone 1 minute over again. I'd just like to thank everybody who's been a part of this really inspiring set of talks. And from SURF, thank you for taking part, and let's keep the conversation going across these coming months. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you and goodbye.